I'll go through my credentials on a specific slide, but I appreciate you all having me. This is kind of what I live and breathe, so happy to talk about it. It was obviously something I went through a master's program for. So today we're going to talk a bit about workplace psychology. It's formerly known as industrial organizational psychology, or IO psych. So it's kind of a mouthful, but I have my own content plan, but I know we're a small-ish group. If you guys have any, you know, discussion questions or anything you want to stop me and say, hey, raise your hand, whatever, feel free. I found it's generally better if it goes that way versus kind of a lecture. Um, so let me see if this will go. We'll kind of go through introductions. I'll tell you a bit more about IO psychology itself and my experience, in the space. We're going to focus specifically on leadership as a subset of IO, how you can all kind of use that knowledge. I know not everyone here is, still in their career, but still, useful to know these things, whether you are still working or if you have, your own, children, what have you, that could use these takeaways. So I'm gonna, go into what we cover as IOs, go into leadership specifically as a function within IO, and then I'll cover some of the implications around leadership, interprofessional relationships, mentorship, job fatigue, the good and the bad regarding leadership, and then tell you a bit more about different leadership styles and where they sit, and then Q&A at the end. And I have some discussion points to go over, but would love to hear from you all as well, of course. So once again, I majored in IO psychology at NYU to get my master's. Before that, I was a neuroscience major at SUNY Binghamton. So at NYU, focus on topics like training and development, work motivation, work attitudes, selection and assessment, leadership, strategic change from an organizational perspective. So really throughout the gamut of any, employee management and things like that. So my master's thesis was on the effects of different leadership styles, on the emergence of burnout, and I used emotional intelligence as kind of a differentiating factor there. So all kind of hot topics I wanted to kind of mesh together. Thus far, most of my training is academic, but the program itself was very applied. So I got to work with a ton of, people in the space. And I'm now holding a generous role for strategic human capital management initiatives for a publicly traded real estate firm. So for me, my motivation going into IO was kind of this overlap that you'll see between the business side and the psychology side. So obviously coming from a neuroscience background, I was very passionate about, psychological principles and down to the molecular level, beyond just, interpersonal relationships. But beyond that, I did kind of have this interest in the business side. So I wasn't traditionally like a finance or business major or anything like that, but I did see IO psychology as a nice kind of hybrid between the two. So being that it's, kind of this mixture of both business and psychology, it seemed like, the perfect degree to kind of go into there. Are people familiar with IO as a subset? It's pretty new. It's not really well known. So let me run through this. So here's just kind of an overview of things that IO psychologists might touch on. Usually when you hear someone is an IO psychologist, they're a PhD. So I wouldn't consider myself an IO psychologist, but maybe, junior version, very junior version of that. You're going to kind of see them taking on any number of things on this list and off this list. So just wanted to kind of put some context out there on IO psychology as its own discipline, since it is a fairly new subset of behavioral psychology, where it focuses within the workplace itself and kind of how people function and commingle there. It originally is kind of this way to obtain information and behavioral insights about a few different, factorial levels. So one being just observing the, psychological or behavioral effects on employees while they're at work, and that's looking at different levels across the organization. So you could look at the individual level, you could look at the group level, you could look at the organization as a whole and kind of see how these things are functioning. We're also going to be looking into things that kind of permeate outside of the workplace. So things like work-life balance or burnout or just general fatigue, things that, you're spending a third plus of your life in this seat or in this place. And what does that mean for, the broader scope of your life kind of thing. So overall, you're looking at ways to identify ways to identify which a workforce can kind of operate as efficiently as possible. You want to, see how to maintain employee motivation, employee satisfaction across all of your populations. So generally, you'll see human capital management kind of pulled out of the traditional HR function, and that's kind of where we sit as IOs. So really, that name came about, which, the name denotes that much like your traditional fungible capital, the humans that make up your organization are, just as important, if not more important, especially today where business dealings are pretty loctite. So you have kind of human capital management being used as a way to gain a competitive edge. So you look at something like D&I, DE&I initiatives, which obviously a huge topic today with everything going on. It's not just a matter of, doing the right thing and taking on the right, DE&I protocol, but it actually shows to have an effect on the bottom line. So industry leaders have the top DE&I protocol, and it's not just kind of, chicken or the egg. It's a direct effect of attracting, well-versed, diverse talent into the workforce, which helps them, if they're in a position where they're selling business, to win more business. So you see things like law firms taking on clients where the clients will say, if you're a bunch of white males, we don't even want to hear you. We don't want you to pitch to us. We're trying to be a little bit more forward facing in the way that we operate. So that's, obviously an important subset there. Aside from leadership, you'll see leadership in DEI, rather, you'll see, coaching, learning and development, system integration. Obviously, these global publicly traded companies have huge swaths of employee data that's getting updated by the minute. And something like a Workday or an Oracle might not be perfect, off the shelf buying direct from the company. You might have to have, a consultancy come in there and kind of integrate the existing system with the new system. So something like that is pretty common as well. So generally, once again, you're kind of talking about more strategic change-driven processes within human capital management, as opposed to kind of like boilerplate HR tasks like onboarding, compensation, benefits, things like that. So I guess now is probably a good time to focus on leadership, since it's why we're here. This is a particularly interesting topic to me for a few reasons. One, I like to think of it as kind of this slippery topic. It's really hard to define, it's really hard to measure, and it's especially hard to kind of curate the leader that you're idealizing. So leadership itself kind of innervates so many different levels and so many different processes throughout the organization that it's so important, but we don't really know exactly what it is. It's different in every organization. It's different for every, subordinate that's kicking up to a leader. So for me, that kind of became my focus throughout my master's degree, and why I chose that as a thesis topic. We're going to obviously discuss, specifics around leadership and leader styles, but in terms of the implications of leaders and leader efficacy, it's undeniable that leaders are one of the key difference makers across the organization. Um, so effective leadership itself is much like, a lot of functions throughout that kind of make up a business. So if you think of like accounting, for example, you might not realize how important it is until something goes wrong. So when there's a gap or breakdown in leadership, that's when you really notice how important it is. Leaders kind of set the tone across the organization for their respective working groups. So they add value just beyond, being X job title, but they actually help to develop those around them when they're effective, add value beyond just, what their job entails, and kind of curate the cultural environment in the workplace. Also, speaking of effective leaders, they're going to be the ones that can identify those gaps in the workforce, can kind of get ahead of things and realize when there's something going wrong and make sure it doesn't escalate. So there's a lot of data out there on leadership, professional mentorship, especially in the workplace, and it's very important for organizations to place a lot of value on the leadership function in order to get the most out of their employees, which I think a lot of organizations don't do as well as they could. So if you obviously there's flip side to that, ineffective leadership. Before I kind of go down that road, anyone have an example or two of bad leadership and maybe how you've categorized that or seen someone and said they're
interject. It's good leadership both on a volunteer and professional level are really important, but you had mentioned earlier about I don't even know how to say it, strategical change. Is that what you said?
Strategic change.
Yes. Yeah. Could you elaborate a little on that?
So a lot of the functions that I mentioned in this slide are kind of umbrellaed underneath that strategic change, or change management is kind of a buzzword there. So anything that is, I guess, quickly moving throughout a workforce. So you think about, okay, we have 1,000 brokers. We have 250 of those are within the kind of junior strata of whichever corporate levels that we're looking at. But we want to identify 15 to 20% of those that we're going to say are high potential in the future. We see them as future leaders. How do we identify them, and how do we create some kind of strategy around how we're going to retain them and develop
exactly
them?
Someone approached us, and for $15,000 they're willing to do that for our organization.
Executive coaching, it's very expensive.
The problem is that 80% of the members of our organization are over 70. So we want to attract diversity and we want to be more inclusive, but we don't know how to go about it. So that's
right.
All right, go ahead.
Justin, I have a question for you. All of this sounds wonderful in a real business world where there are paid employees and people are interviewed before they're hired. We are a mostly volunteer organization, so people have really good hearts that they're willing to volunteer, but their abilities are an unknown. And the question is, how do you make a successful nonprofit organization that is volunteer, except for very, very few paid professionals, succeed when your volunteers potentially could be clueless about what their job is and how they go about doing it?
Right. That's
a toughie.
Yeah, not the easiest one. I think, there are two parts to that. One, you have how do we get people in the door, and how do we, grow our population, versus, how do we sort out based on who's here, who the leaders are going to be. So I think in that order is where you probably tackle that. And incentives are incentives. So when you know, you obviously lose some bargaining power when you're talking about, there's no payment for this, but offering
We'll give you a
different
pat on the
incentives,
back.
whether yeah, I mean, verbal praise even is really effective in adults, weirdly enough, like more effective than it is in kids that are the ones that people are saying good job to all the time. So some kind of recognition program, or if there is obviously a budget for it, let's say you offer some kind of development program or some kind of learning opportunity or something for people to kind of reach for, and holding that carrot out. Because I don't think within an organization there's always kind of the reverse motivation of I might lose my job if I don't do this well. I don't think I don't think you're necessarily dealing with that
Please,
in this
please lose
group.
my job.
So yeah, I know that wasn't super helpful, but um,
Okay.
it's
Hang on a second.
a start,
Jane,
just kind of thinking about
Jane,
those
you had
things.
your hand up?
I also had my
I
hand
ran
up.
a
Oh,
volunteer
sorry.
organization.
Thank you.
Jane, hold on a second. Donna was first.
Yeah,
Sorry.
hi. So I think we're getting to mentorship and helping people to understand what is their job. There needs to have really good, like, turnover. I'll just go with that.
No, but that's also 2 points. You have to identify the people who are going to be the mentors and who are going to be the mentees. Is that a word?
That's people that have been
Yep.
there. Okay. Debbie,
Yeah,
can
okay.
I talk?
Yeah.
Okay, I ran a volunteer organization. You have to, with volunteers, you have to, treat them with kid gloves, because there's no paycheck incentive. There's no carrot in front of them. Also, you need a job description first, and then you have to train them in what they're doing if they're not, doing it effectively or having it. Correct? What's his name?
Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of these things you'll probably be able to take, bits and pieces out for your organization. But it's kind of a conglomerate of different processes to put in place, because you think about, do we have these things laid out where, this person's supposed to be doing this person's supposed to be doing this? Is that a little bit sloppy and maybe, something to attack first? Are we, historically losing people over the years? Like how many people on average should we bring on? How do we get those people? How do we find those people? Is it a name recognition thing? It could be so many different things to tackle before you
Yes,
say,
yes, and yes.
okay, we're going to remove this person from the e-board and plug in this other person because of XYZ.
Yeah, we have a problem with that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you going to go into leadership styles? That's
Yep.
what I thought it was about. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Back in school.
I just made him go off on a tangent. Sorry.
No worries.
No,
I
it's
think we
okay.
had one more question. I saw a hand up somewhere. No?
Put it in the chat if you want to ask a question. That way I can check it.
I have the reverse question, which is because of a lot of us are over 70, we've had tons of experience in different kinds of work. So are there tactics for tapping into that and knowing who has the best fit for what we need done? It's sort of the same thing as it would be for any for-profit business.
Right. That's going to be a little bit more relevant in the next couple slides. So if I don't clear that up, then I'll circle back on it. Okay. Where were we? Leadership.
You asked for
Bad leadership. So
you asked for an example of bad leadership.
right.
I have an example.
Yeah, go for it.
In my former workplace, I had a fabulous boss who developed me in my role as a leader. And then there was a reorganization, that occurred on Yom Kippur. So I was assigned a new manager who didn't take into account my religious preferences, and in addition, expected me to perform tasks that I was not able to do, that I was not, that was not in my wheelhouse. So I quit.
Got it. Yeah, there's no shortage of examples of bad leadership. I'd be surprised if there were someone on the phone that hasn't seen a bad leader or had a terrible experience with leaderships. But just, if you sit and think about it for a second and think about, your experience, if you've had, a handful of jobs throughout your life, and the difference, good or bad, that leader made. I mean, I'm early in my career, but I've had a few roles, and my, even day to day, inside and outside of work, life satisfaction was definitely, it wasn't everything, obviously, but it makes a difference. And if you have someone who's sitting there and supporting you and, taking you aside to make sure that you're good and you don't need anything, and kind of having that back and forth, open communication and ability to, broach certain topics that you might not otherwise be able to with certain leaders, I think is crucial for, especially today, and some of the newer generations that are making up huge swaths of the workforce. Say what you will about them, which, I'm obviously included in there, but yeah, there tends to be a bit more emphasis on, nurturing in the workforce. So I think it's, abundantly important there. But yeah, in terms of outcomes of bad leadership, you're going to have things like burnout, you're going to have, reduced motivation, things like that. And whether, it's from a personal perspective or from a business perspective, you're talking about, money lost, and, just an unhappy, unmotivated employee population. So. All right, so here's where we'll get through some of those styles. So I just wanted to kind of overview some of the main leadership constructs. I, again, don't want to make this like a full-on lecture, so I'll just kind of run through some of the more popular ones in the literature. So these were all, for example, in my master's thesis in one form or another. I'll do the second one first, transactional leadership. It's kind of the traditional quid pro quo leadership style. So it's, get your work done, you're getting paid, you get your work done, you're getting, X bonus. And it's very linear in terms of that relationship. So, rewards are given based on work output. Those rewards could be compensation, bonuses, development opportunities, or just, verbal praise once again. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, which is that first bullet point up there, generally is going to be regarded as the gold standard for leadership. So, if you type in transformational leadership into Google, you're going to get a ton. And it's generally, looking at leaders that go beyond this transactional relationship with their subordinates, and drive things like emotional stimulation, inspirational motivation, and individual consideration. So, again, another mouthful there, but essentially it's defining that leader who, deeply cares about the success and well-being of their subordinates and acts as a role model, which is really important. So a big kind of rift that you'll see between managers and subordinates is if the manager doesn't seem like they're, bought into the team, and they're kind of just there as like a line manager, and they're just kind of barking orders and, not quote unquote in the trenches with their people, but really acting as a role model makes that difference. So someone you can kind of look up to and say, I want to take that person's job one day. That's generally your transformational leader. So, really cares about the employee, goes beyond kind of that, quid pro quo transactional relationship. Hands-off leaders, I'm sure, you can think of one or two throughout your life. It's also, they call it like laissez-faire leadership. pretty simple. So it's, those managers that say, keep doing what you're doing, but not even up to that standard of communication. So pretty ineffective. You're not going to want to, develop those people that look like they have laissez-faire leadership styles. And then charisma tends to be a pretty well sought after type of leadership. So that is also baked into transformational leadership. So they kind of go hand in hand. Charisma or charismatic leadership is a more antiquated version of transformational leadership, according to a good amount of the research out there. It kind of blossomed from the focus on charisma. I think where it kind of branches off is charisma. You're talking about likability of a person versus, how effective they are in encouraging and developing others. So it's great if someone's charismatic, but they might, also not have the most effective leadership style when it comes to knowing their employees and being intellectually stimulating and things like that. So,
or even having a good outcome.
right. Right. So narcissism or narcissistic leadership is like the dark side of leadership. So you're looking at those leaders who basically do everything exactly the opposite of what you'd want your ideal leader to do. You see a lot of crossover between narcissistic leaders and transactional leaders. So they're not, knowledge sharing. They kind of keep everything to themselves. They don't they don't really care so much about those around them, and which is obviously a terrible trait once again for a leader. So not a ton to dig into there, but it kind of goes hand in hand with just the general definition of being a narcissist. So you can kind of see how that would translate in a business sense. I know we talked about bad leadership, but not necessarily those that you've interacted with, but who are some of the, examples or ideals for leadership, past, present, living or not, that you could think of when you think about, this is my ideal leader. This is, if I could be this person running this company or this country, whatever it is, what are some of the kind of the names that come to mind there?
You said from history, so I think Abraham Lincoln. I think he was a true leader who understood the situation, who listened to his rivals. He kept them close to him. He had a clear vision where he wants to go. I read a book called The Team of Rivals when he got all his rivals into his cabinet, and he actually listened to them. And listening is a very important skill, but once you commit to it, you really have to listen, not just pretend and implement and so on. Because it's easy to pretend that you listen to your co-workers and so on, but actually hear what they're saying and be attuned. So anyway, my ideal is Abraham Lincoln.
Got it. Yeah, and he embodies a lot of at least through tales of history, a lot of the transformational side, where, like you said, he did take input from people who he didn't necessarily have to, but he saw as being of resource for what he was trying to do. So that kind of foresight and that interpersonal intellect is paramount for transformational leaders. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would just I know that Bill Clinton had lots of charisma, but
Yes.
I don't know 100% that he was a transformational leader. I really wouldn't know.
Right. I think you're probably going to find that the most in politics. You have a lot of, pretty faces and, people who are well spoken and well liked. But if you look, brass tacks, what did they do, or things like that, it's not always correlated.
Okay.
All right. So
Yes.
no, go ahead. Go. Yep.
I just say, you're looking, I think, for a team leader in a transformational leadership, correct? That cares about the bottom line, of course,
Right.
but and the people within it. Now, I had a hands-off manager at one point, and but she was wonderful. She knew how to hire, and she knew who she could let go and let everybody do anything. She put me out the first month I was there. I knew nothing, and I went to speak to people. So she was smart that way, but she was hands off. She didn't do much because it was a political thing, but
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it works sometimes. Sometimes being hands off works, and you could even lump that under transformational leadership if they say, okay, Jane doesn't really need much, and maybe she's better when we say, here's what you got to do, and go off and do it, and she's not going to need a lot of input or coaching. So
well, it's like situational things, like it's Truman who said that. It depends on the situation. You
Right.
can't say that somebody's always, people could be in all these categories and be a leader,
absolutely.
but not at the same time.
I
Right.
think what Jane described, I don't know if it's necessarily hands off. I think maybe it's a model of a mentor, because a mentor knows the people he's working with, and he knows when he step back and let the person go and do, but you keep an eye, and when you think, oh, I think it's time to check in, to suggest, to talk. But I think that for me, I ran a school for 20 some years, and this mentoring model worked very well for me. So I believe in it.
Yeah, it's
So Judith,
very
in
useful.
mentoring you got the biggest job on the board.
Oh, me? I didn't have the biggest job. Yeah, anyway, thanks. That's what we do. It brings back, things that in a different way, with a different twist, and find it very interesting. Yeah.
Right.
When you were saying about the hands-off or a burnout, I remember one of my teachers was a Father Owens. It was a Jesuit school. He said that what people reach is a stage of bureaucratic interpretation of job description, meaning this is what it reads, this is what I do, I don't add, I don't do, like blindfolds, but I like the description, bureaucratic interpretation of job description. And
That
I
is good.
saw throughout my career, I saw people reach that point. So yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of when you see people become numb to the workplace because it's just digging at them too much. So they just say, I'm going to show up and kind of slave through it and go home and get on to my actual life. So yeah, there's I don't know who my favorite leader would be. I really like Alan Mullally, Ford guy. He's very charismatic, and he turned them around after 2009. And Carly Fiorina, love her.
Oh, she was, yeah.
She didn't have a great, political run, but at HP, she was, I thought, and HP at that time was just a mess. All right, so in terms of what we can do and how we can develop leaders, there's not a ton of, as you mentioned, easily accessible resources or cheap resources in terms of leadership training, and the training offered by these consultancies again comes with a very high price tag. There's obviously tons of books and things like that on leadership and management and managerial tactics, things like that. But you're generally going to be, when you think about a traditional leadership intervention, you're going to focus on mostly kind of the stylistic changes in communication for leaders. So kind of setting a cadence or a methodology for delivering feedback down to your subordinates, even acting as that liaison between your subordinates and the higher ups. So a lot of people have trouble they might turn one way and say to their subordinates, hey, like, would love to get you this, would love to, open up these development opportunities. I hope that, this time around, we're really going to fight and go up to bat for you to get, XYZ promotion, raise, what have you. But when it comes to, dealing with the higher ups, they don't necessarily act as that promoter for those people. So really encouraging them, and not encouraging them, but showing them the skills of, this is the way that you handle these conversations. There's obviously a lot of tough conversations in leadership. So being able to kind of work through those and developing a method for getting through that, in order to not just encourage growth, but actually take action and be more effective when it comes to your subordinates. So in terms of, leadership, do you think it's possible to kind of, curate a leader? Or you think if you look at someone and you say that person's not a leader, do you think it's possible to, train them to be an effective leader? I personally think there are some, boundary conditions to that. You can't have someone who's, coding behind a desk all day and, hates anything interpersonal related at work, is not going to be, standing up and be like the Elon Musk of the world and getting on stage and things like that. Maybe not the best example, but do you think it's possible to kind of turn that ship around?
No, if that person doesn't have the basics, I don't think so. I think all the CEOs of all the nonprofits that I know.
I think it's possible if there's if someone's motivated.
I think it's not possible that they have the leadership skills. They need to be developed. I come from teaching, and we found over the years, because I trained a lot of teachers, that they either had those leadership skills also in teaching, or they didn't. They needed to be developed, especially new student teachers. But we could see that where they were green and needed help, but they were innate, is all I can say. And you couldn't, whatever we tried, they couldn't be turned around.
Yeah, and I mean it's still an open-ended question. No one will say yes or no, because there's a lot of gray area in there. But you know who those like magnetic people are that you see them and you can't take their eyes off of them, and you're hanging on their every word. There's definitely some innate level to that. It's really hard to teach that, but I think especially now in the world of Silicon Valley CEOs, who a lot of them were the nerdy people, and now they're standing up and now they are leading companies. There's definitely a lot of ground that can be made up by bringing in, whether it's an executive coach or just putting people in those positions to learn and adopt their own leadership style. There's definitely ground to be made up for, but I think, like you said, there are probably a ton of people out there who are hopeless. So they're not going to be the guy or girl or woman.
Not everybody can be a leader. That's the thing too. You don't want everybody to lead. You have all
exactly.
You'll have all chiefs and no Indians.
I think that to start with, a person has to be a people person. That if a person is comfortable with people and comfortable speaking with people and comfortable dealing with people, then they can be taught, I think, to be a good leader. And a lot of it is probably intuitive. But, the person who's not a people person will have a much harder time, I think, learning leadership skills.
Justin, you mentioned accounting. Now, accountants are not people first, people, whatever, person, whatever. So,
or whatever you're about to say, I come from a long line of accountants, so
exactly.
No,
be careful.
No problem with accountants. But you say there needs leadership there. There is leadership.
Jane, to get new clients, you have to have personality.
You have to
to make them feel comfortable and confident, in your skills and project that. So, it depends.
It depends, but that's in a private business.
Yeah, well, that's the reason why leadership tends to be looked at as kind of this ceiling for certain people, because, salespeople are those, more personable, more, just good at developing their interpersonal relationships versus, other subsets of any given business. But if you're high enough up in any business, you're going to be selling something. Almost definitely. And even for, yourselves, you mentioned earlier, you're trying to sell not to prospective, joiners. So there's always going to be that aspect to it.
The sales piece of it. Sure.
Yep. You're right.
And then just last thing here, emotional intelligence, just because, again, very hot topic, not just in IO psychology, but beyond, you're bound to see emotional intelligence or EIEQ anywhere that you look, as long as they're talking about businesses, or they're even looking at children's studies of emotional intelligence now and trying to extrapolate them out and see where these kids end up in their careers. So there's not a ton of data between leadership and emotional intelligence, but I did take that on as one of the factors of my thesis, and you're generally going to see that more effective leaders and more transformational leaders do have a higher emotional intellect, which should come as no surprise.
I think they were much more successful in college when they tested the kids and then checked on them, like in longitudinal studies.
Mm-hmm.
They were more successful in college.
Exactly. Yeah, it's starting to become a really specific topic that is getting a lot of attention right now. I mean, through what I've seen, I think it's worthwhile to kind of focus on it, because it is a little bit more regimented in the way that it's measured, and you do see high corollary between emotional intelligence and just, down to overall earning potential and career success. So that's it for the content I had planned. If anyone has specific questions, I do have one last discussion point that I wanted to get to, but I figure, let everyone go first if they have any, burning questions. All right. So we'll start with mine.
What if,
no, go ahead.
What if you're in a situation where it's clear that the leader isn't doing their job and you're working in that situation? How do you tackle getting it better on track?
I think it's tough as a subordinate, especially. I think it's going to be like a speak with your feet kind of conversation, or kind of move in a lot of cases. But if there is an opening and it's not, this is my manager from hell, and there is, an opportunity to kind of open up communication, there's always the idea of kind of managing upwards, which some people are better at it than others. And just, if your manager's not the type to, set aside time for you and doesn't really understand your needs and development, career-wise, kind of setting that time yourself. So I think especially early in my career, I made it a point to, if my manager was not the type to, take out that time or take out those resources, kind of putting it on them. And obviously you have to tread carefully when you're doing those things. But, even if it's a matter of saying, hey, can we book, a weekly 30-minute meeting and just, catch up on stuff and talk about, where I'm at and things like that. I think that's, if there's insufficient communication there, introducing the communication, because a lot of times people are going to be receptive to that, rather than say, no, why would I meet with you when it would be kind of a ridiculous response to something like that.
Justin, what about an open door policy with leaders? The manager.
I mean, kind of the opposite. People could take advantage of it, but as the manager, kind of putting a stop to it. I think, people who are fully functioning adults in the workforce tend to not take too much advantage of that. But I think you also might have like unlimited PTO is something where it's a little bit snaky because people end up taking less PTO if they give unlimited PTO as a company. So if you have an open door policy, you might have an instance where if someone's not, outgoing, they might not want to walk in the door. So I'd be, careful of just saying, it's similar to saying, keep doing what you're doing. That's one of the easiest ways to lose top performers, because top performers are top performers for a reason. They're very driven and motivated. They want to know how they can do better. So it's better to tell someone, some kind of constructive feedback and like give them something to develop versus, you're happy with their work. So you tell them that you're happy with their work.
Justin, I'd be interested hearing your take on the difference between a manager and a leader, because we kind of use them interchangeably. You were saying leader, manager, and I seem to think that manager and leader are not necessarily the same. Manager, yeah, go ahead. I mean, I'm just interested in you.
I don't think there's one way to define one versus another. I think leadership just kind of captures anyone who has somebody looking up to them in some form or another within an organization. Leadership also, I think as a topic remains leadership because it wasn't always based in the corporate setting. So you kind of have like the vestiges of people who are leaders, but weren't necessarily, the CEO of an organization, because that still does help inform what we're looking at in terms of, followers and how they react to different leadership styles. So not a huge difference. It's probably a Venn diagram that looks a lot like this slide with the overlap, but that's what I'd say.
Yeah. I kind of thought that, well, it's the same. You need, even your manager, you're assigned to manage your group and to reach your goal. And of course, you have to lead them. But when I think of leadership, I also think that would be the person who has the bigger picture, not the specific task. The picture, the bigger, setting the vision.
Right.
And so that's where I see a little bit of it. Of course, a manager has to be a leader on his or her group that he manages. And for me, leadership was more like the bigger thing, like I said, vision,
right.
mission.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at it as like, are they a leader or are they just a manager? I don't think there's any downside in looking at it like that. It doesn't necessarily translate to like an academic sense, but I don't think it's a huge sticking point for an environment like this. But that's before I started going into these concepts, that's generally how I looked at it as well. It was like, managers might or might not be leaders depending on how effective they are.
Yeah.
Well, but an effective manager would be a leader.
Right.
Thank you, Justin.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
And
anybody else have questions? Who haven't we heard from? Doris, you have to say anything? Esther, you want to say something? Anybody have any other questions?
How much time do we have? 10 minutes?
No, we're done.
Oh, we're done? Okay.
We're done.
Well, right. I'll tell you my discussion question. You could think of it on your own. But like women in leadership, obviously this is a women's group. I just was going to, ask about your experience throughout your careers in terms of, women in positions of leadership, because that's a really hot topic. And there's a lot of, stigma and different ways that people are
women in charge
received.
of leaderships are
So
horrible.
if we have
Exactly.
time, I'd like to share an anecdote, if we have time.
Go ahead.
So I came to my position as the superintendent of the Cleveland Hebrew Schools after a gentleman who was a wonderful superintendent. He was at the position at the time about 15 years, and I came after him. Now, a lot of the other pieces were in place. I was more responsible for hiring teachers that I thought I could be working better with, but there was a building manager, a gentleman who walked around with a toothpick in his mouth all the time and would go around, look at the building, and then would tell me that the roof needs this and the boiler needs that, because I was responsible for everything. So one time we had a leak in the basement, and he brought a plumber or whoever to work. And he went down with the worker, and I went down with him. I wanted to see what's going on. And he's telling me, you know what, you don't need to be here. I'll deal with him. I'll talk to you later. And he was, in terms of the chain of command, I was his boss. But he did not see me in that position. So I don't know where I got the guts. I was very young at the time. I said, okay, this meeting is over now. Please come up to my office and we need to talk. And he came up, looked at me, was like in shock. I said, listen, I treat you with respect and I expect the same respect from you. And I don't want you ever to talk to me this way. And he was like, oh, I apologize. Okay, I knew this meeting won't change much, but he tried. Around Yom HaAtzmaut, just before, I had a program for an assembly, and I shared with the kids my experience in the IDF. And I happened to have shown a slide of me holding a rifle. Now, if you were observant, you saw that I was not aiming anywhere because both my eyes were open. I just had the rifle, I didn't, and he happened to have seen this. He walked by and he saw this. So he came back to my office later and says, listen, I have to admit, I could not see a woman sitting in that chair. However, you're a woman who handled the rifle. I'm okay with you. And then,
Bravo.
little did he know that I never used it only in training, but then I was okay, and I got totally different respect from him. I just thought it was a funny story.
Oh, that's good. Definitely a good note to end on, and maybe the next management book.
You'll
Right.
put it in.
Thank you,
Okay,
Justin.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
If you have questions,
Thank you.
send them to me and I will forward them on to Justin. Okay?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Have a good night.
Pesach
Bye-bye.
Sameach, everyone.